Next up are things that help to protect our central nervous system. So of course, things like our scalp and our skin are involved with protecting our brain. And of course, the skull and the vertebral column are bones that help to protect the brain and spinal cord. But there are some new things that we're going to take a look at here. The meninges, which are membranes that protect the brain and spinal cord, cerebral spinal fluid, and then something called the blood-brain barrier. So first we're going to start by talking about the meninges. These are sheet-like structures, so they're membranes, that protect both the brain and spinal cord from trauma and infection. Right? So if you're in a car accident, the meninges are one of the things that can kind of absorb some of the impact so that your nervous system tissue isn't damaged. And the meninges are really important for prevention of infection. The brain and spinal cord have very little defense against pathogens. Their main line of defense is to stop pathogens from getting in the first place, and most of that is controlled through these meninges. Now the meninges have 3 layers. Okay, these are called maters or matters, if you want to pronounce it that way. There's the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater is the most superficial of the 3 layers, so it's the most externally located one. And it's very, very tough. Dura mater translates as tough mother in Latin, and this is a rather tough meninge. Okay? Very, very, very protective. Deep to the dura mater, we'll find the arachnoid mater, and it's named for the fact that it looks like spider webs. There's a space between the arachnoid mater and the next layer, the pia mater, and this is called the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space is important because it's filled with a fluid called cerebral spinal fluid that we'll talk more about in a little bit. And then last is the pia mater. This is the deepest of the meninges. It lays right on the brain and spinal cord tissue itself, and it really is the weakest of the 3 layers. Next up is cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. Cerebral spinal fluid is a fluid that we find both inside and outside of the brain and spinal cord. It's very similar in its composition to blood plasma. Blood plasma is mostly water with dissolved nutrients and some gases and some proteins in it. Cerebral spinal fluid is very important because it forms a watery cushion that does protect the brain and spinal cord from trauma. But the cerebral spinal fluid is also helping to circulate things like nutrients and gases through the central nervous system. Cerebral spinal fluid is produced in spaces in the brain called ventricles. So you might not have realized it, but you have these very large spaces in your brain called ventricles. I think of them as like lakes inside of the brain. And that's where the cerebral spinal fluid is produced. And it will flow from one lake to the next. We have 4 ventricles or 4 lakes inside the brain. And the cerebral spinal fluid flows from ventricle to ventricle, and then eventually the cerebral spinal fluid is circulated into that subarachnoid space that I mentioned that we find between the pia and arachnoid mater. Some of the cerebral spinal fluid also will flow down the central canal of the spinal cord. If the cranial bones don't close properly, that can result in a condition called hydrocephaly in an infant, which is excess cerebral spinal fluid surrounding the brain. In that case, what they'll do is they will insert a shunt which will take the fluid from the brain and usually put it into a different body cavity like the peritoneal cavity. And then last here is the blood-brain barrier. It's called the blood-brain barrier, but we also have a blood-spinal cord barrier, but no one ever talks about it that way. And so what this is a coating that we put on the capillaries that are bringing blood to both the brain and the spinal cord. And the coating on the capillaries is actually made of helper cells in the nervous system called neuroglial cells. So these neuroglial cells coat the capillaries, and then that gives us some selectivity in which compounds are able to leave the bloodstream and enter into the extracellular fluid of the brain and spinal cord. So this extra barrier can prevent some things from passing, like certain metabolic wastes. A lot of drugs can't pass through the blood-brain barrier, and there's a few other things too. It is not a barrier to certain compounds, like any compounds that are lipid soluble can cross this blood-brain barrier. So things like alcohol, for example, and gases of any kind can get across it quite easily. But it is helpful for preventing some compounds from entering. But for example, your adrenal glands above your kidneys release adrenaline, and that's really important for most of your body to function, but adrenaline can't cross your blood-brain barrier. And it's good that it can't, because if it did, it could cause a lot of things to go wrong in your brain and spinal cord. And since we're talking about blood vessels associated with the brain, I wanted to mention strokes at this time. So a stroke is also called a cerebral vascular accident, and it results from a blood vessel either being clogged or rupturing in a region of the brain. So a lot of times this is caused by a blood clot called an embolus. So an embolus is a blood clot that's formed somewhere else in the body and has traveled to the brain, and then it's clogged some of the small blood vessels in the brain, starving the brain tissue. A stroke can also be caused by something called an aneurysm, and this is a little different. It doesn't involve a blood clot. Instead, what happens is the blood vessel wall becomes weak, and it starts to kind of balloon out as the pressure builds up inside of the blood vessel, and it continues to weaken, and eventually it can pop, and then the blood flows out of the vessel, and again starving the surrounding tissue. The consequences of a stroke differ from person to person. Sometimes hemiplegia occurs, which is one-sided paralysis. So for example, if you have a stroke on the left side of your brain, it can cause paralysis on the right side. Aphasias can occur. So if you have a stroke on the left side of your brain, which is where most of your language centers are, that can result in problems with understanding and producing language called aphasia. And since we're talking about the brain, I wanted to mention Alzheimer's disease, because this is a terrible disease that is becoming more and more abundant as people live longer and longer. So Alzheimer's disease is a progressive degenerative brain disease with the main symptom of dementia. And it's mostly seen in the elderly, but it can begin in your middle ages. And some of the structure changes that occur with the brain with Alzheimer's disease include enlargement of those brain ventricles, those lakes that I mentioned. But there's also abnormal proteins and protein fibers that are produced in the brain. So individuals with Alzheimer's disease obviously have dementia, but they also have irritability, confusion, and ultimately this can result in death. And as medicine allows us to live longer and longer and longer, Alzheimer's disease is becoming more and more of a problem because our brain isn't necessarily keeping up with the longevity of our body. And this graph kind of just shows you the predictions of the incidences of Alzheimer's disease coming up. So as you can see, it's going to become more and more of a problem.